Must have been a file size limit I hit there. I was just saying this ring's going to come out. It's just not enthusiastic about it. That's it, it's on its way. Oh yeah, I can see it's distorted. Yeah, it's quite distorted at the top here. I'll have to see if I can straighten those edges up, or at least file them down smooth so they're not catching on everything. Okay, apart from that, that actually looks good. What about the lens and shutter? Well, the lens is very dirty looking. The shutter, does it function well? Let's try it on a slow speed. Well, that was 1 second and that ran down fine. I wouldn't be complaining about that. Whether this comes apart easily, that's another matter. I suspect that lens is going to give me grief, but I've got answers for that. So let me get this body stuff into the ultrasonic cleaner and be back to reassemble it. Well, I've been busy. As you can see, I've cleaned up that body. Got all the dirt and dust and rubbish out of it. There's a lot of dust. I was checking the bellows very closely and there was a tiny pinhole back at the crease right here. Now, I checked it and that was the only hole that was there, so I've put a patch on the inside of the bellows. It's pretty hard to see in there, but there's a patch just on the inside covering probably a couple of those pleats. That certainly seals that up nicely. This thing, this kept me entertained. This was in bad shape. It wasn't so much that it was bent, it's that things were missing. It was missing at least one washer here, and what that had done is it meant that everything was sloppy. Instead of this being fairly firm at this point, it was just loose and flopped all around the place. I have to say it's no fun taking these things apart. I didn't enjoy it. I never enjoy it. It certainly doesn't get any better with practice. It's a cursed thing. I've got a couple of extra washers in here to take up some space, just to make sure that there's no slop in the system. But those struts are nice and firm now, and I'm sure that they'll work well in the camera. That was probably the most serious issue, I would say, with the camera, was the state of those struts. They were just bent, and as I say, they were sloppy here because at least one washer was missing. I hate doing those things. The focus mount, I've cleaned that. That wasn't too hard. What grease was in there had dried up, powdered up, and had basically disappeared. There wasn't even the wax left really. That was just shot. That was gone. The inner and outer helical move smoothly together. They are probably stiffer than I would normally like. Well, when I say stiffer, there's no movement in there at all to speak of. Normally there's a little bit of movement, and the grease, of course, evens that out. This is very, very close. The inner and outer threads are very close to each other. Can't afford to overpack that with grease. It will not want to turn. So that's about the state of the nation with this. I've got to get these bits and pieces into the body, and I'll do that now. The spring, the return spring for the shutter release it's a bit unusual looking. I'm not even convinced it's the original. It's quite stiff and it's quite rusty looking. So I've found another one in my parts bins which I think will work better. That again ties in with these struts and the missing washer or two that was in the struts, and because I think someone's had this apart at some stage, probably for what was a good reason at the time, but certainly it's a nuisance. So I'll start getting this back together. I'll start by putting a bit of molybdenum paste on that rod that the shutter release runs on, and I'll put the spring in place. the struts. I'll lubricate the shaft that these levers run on, again using molybdenum paste. And this runs on the strut and the body, of course. Right, so I'll put some synthetic grease in the slots at the back here. I won't do the ones at the front yet because I'll only end up rubbing it off on my fingers while I'm trying to get all this in place. I'm going to get this in position. So I get that over the post, drop the struts into the body. That's all looking promising. Now there's a spacer washer, top and bottom, that go in between the body and the struts at this position. So I've got to slide those down into place. Just trying to see if I can see through the washer, so I've got that in the right place. And I should have two. One of these screws should do that job nicely. These screws are a bit less than pretty. I'll put one there. Now I've got to get one washer in the same position at the bottom of the camera. Pull that across to where I can get at it. And get the screw in position. Yeah, that picked up okay. So that's two of the screws. I'll just collapse those struts. Open the back of the camera. I've got to get the two screws into the film cassette chamber. Now these screws were, the heads on them were painted black, but that paint has disappeared in the cleaning process. That's neither here nor there, because in most cases they use nickel plated screws without any black paint at all in that position. So those two screws are in position. I can tighten the four screws up. And that's my struts in place. And they're nice and firm now. That's good. The movement in this direction here, that's limited by the door. The door supports the front standard at this point, but this was just flopping all around previously. So here we've got the lens mount. I'm just going to get this swung into position. Oh yes, this is an early example. Okay. And four screws hold this in place. Well, that's that mutilated looking one. You'll notice I fitted that screw at the front there for the shutter coupling. It's wise to have that fitted at this stage and then just remove it and install it. It once you put the shutter in place, otherwise this lever can flop around the back with nothing to stop it moving, and then it can jam as you open and shut the camera. Very disconcerting. Alright, so we'll get these 4 screws done up tight. Now we've got 4 screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. The screw's busy trying to get away there. That out. Right, I'll just run those screws down. Now you've got the thickness of the leather on the front of the bellows, and you have the felt light trap behind there between the 2 pieces of metal, so the screws do not tighten up and come to a sudden stop like if you're tightening 2 pieces of metal together. So don't overdo it. They'll just keep tightening until you snap something. Alright, there's our front struts in place. The patch for the bellows would have cut through at the top there. I'm fairly convinced, because the struts were damaged and because things had been flopping around. I think that's why those bellows wore through at the top. It's fairly well tucked away down there. It would have to be things getting forced when this was all being pushed out of shape for that to cut through. Okay, well that appears to be good. That's our shutter release mechanism. It all moves nicely. So I've got to lubricate the inner and outer helical with some helical grease, and drop that into place next. Oh, here's my focus helical. Let's just get some helical grease on this. I'm using Helimax XP optical instrument and helical grease, and this stuff seems to work very well. You don't need lots. A few small patches around there and then work this in. That's all that's required. Just work that backwards and forwards. Run some around the outside. This has to move in that lens mount. This brass here is quite dull and dark looking. That's surface corrosion really. That's because of age and the hard life it's probably had. And this goes on one way up because I've marked it. Let's drop that into place. The retaining ring, I'll put some some of this helical grease, since I've got it here. I'll run that around the inside edge of that at the back. That's where it holds that down in place. Doesn't require much. That sits in here. Just making sure that the inner is sticking out slightly, otherwise it'll tend to jam up. I'll get the 6 screws in position. Get them all in position before you tighten anything up. Otherwise you'll inevitably find that there was a minor alignment problem and it's going to cause you grief. You want to keep 4 particularly good screws for the focus scale ring. And they don't need to be quite so pretty to do this job. And that's because the focus scale ring typically requires the edges of the screws to do a lot of the work. And if it's been damaged in the past, the screws will be damaged and they won't hold the focus scale ring correctly. Some of these screws I can see have been overstressed because they're a little bit distorted. Okay, that's that. Here's our focus scale ring. Now I've put my alignment marks on there, so I should be able to find those. Yep, let's pull that down out of the way. Yeah, this ring's a bit distorted. It almost certainly has jumped jumped at some stage. Just looking at my alignment marks and they don't look like they align there. So there's too many scratch marks on this ring. I'll have to have a close look at this and make sure I get it on in the right position. Yeah, that looks like it. I'll get it screwed on there. Well, that's all back on. That looks quite good. Moves smoothly. I'm very pleased with that. I think I can put the door on the front of the camera next. Oh, I might want to glue that up first. The leather on this is pretty, yeah, it's fairly loose. I don't think I'll attempt to remove it completely. It's pretty fragile, but I will lift it and apply some adhesive underneath that. I want to get that leather all pushed back into position and glued firmly. First thing I need to do is clean underneath the leather with a bit of naphtha. I've just got a bit of cotton from a cotton bud, Q-tip. Now I can wipe that under here to remove any grease or oil, dust, other rubbish, so that when I put my glue under there, I've got clean surfaces for the glue to stick to. You can see the rubbish that comes out from there. Some of that's rust. Now, short of completely dismantling this door, removing all the rust, repainting it and so forth, there's no likelihood of that being dealt with. It is possible to refinish parts like this. But that's really going above and beyond. And I won't be doing that today. Alright, that's good. I've got that rubbish out from under there now. What I'll do is put some glue on here and then squeeze that out. I'm particularly concerned for the leather here. That's been rolled up from years of thumb. If people pulled that door open and they've rolled that leather back, I'm going to try and get that to lie flat. I've squeezed some glue onto a piece of paper here and I'll use a toothpick to transfer that in underneath the leather. the adhesive's probably given up here, well, the original adhesive's given up mostly because of corrosion. Almost certainly the camera has been stored somewhere in a damp conditions and rust gets in there and then rapidly starts looking like this. Let's see how we get on here. I've got plenty of glue in there, so I've got to, with the glue squeeze out, I'll have a bit of cleaning up to do. I want this leather to lie down nice and flat. Because I'll be giving it some dye and wax polish later to give that leather the black colour it once upon a time had. Oh yes, probably been a bit generous with the glue there. I can see that leather's going to lie down fairly well, so that's good. I think this is the only patch of bad leather on the camera. That looks good. See if I can encourage that to lie flat. With old leather like this in particular, because it's very thin, it's very dry and fairly brittle, it's quite important to get it all stuck back down as soon as you become aware of a problem, because otherwise it's likely to fragment and break off. Pieces of it can just break off, and then you've got a bigger problem trying to patch it. Much easier if you catch it early and glue the original back in place, not have to replace it. That's looking good. That'll clean up very well. This camera dates from the late 40s, so it's got a few years on it now. Just using Naphtha here to remove glue squeeze out, because it's easier to get it while it's still soft. Right, I'm happy with the look of that. That's much better. That'll look much better again once I've cleaned all the leather and put some of the colour back to it, because it's somewhat washed out. Looking at the very faded state of the leather on this camera, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it hasn't spent a good deal of time sitting on a shelf somewhere and it's caught a lot of sun. Well, while you weren't watching, because I'd forgotten to turn the camera on, I've got the front door back on there, and as you can see, it pops open nicely. They were never intended to spring all the way to the open position, simply pop enough that you could get your thumb under there and open the front. That's moving nice and smoothly. Focus is good, and there's no undue play. The lens standard is good, everything is rigid, works as it should have done. So with that little part of the job out of the way, I can turn my attention to the film advance mechanism. Well, I might as well start with this rewind and get that just pushed out of the way, since it doesn't really affect anything else. So I'll just put some synthetic grease on there. Pop that on the top of the camera. We want 2 screws. Of course, it only had 1 screw originally, so I will have to find one from my spare parts. The chrome plating on this piece there is just pretty much gone. That's deteriorated. It will be a bad chrome job, much like the job that was done on the focus scale ring, and it'll just be down to the shortage of materials at the time, I would think. Okay, so that's the rewind back on there out of the way. That's the simple part. We don't need to worry about that anymore. Okay, so as for the rest of it, let's start getting these pieces together in one place. So we want the shaft and the bush, and we will want the take-up spool and 3 screws to hold that bush in place. Just we've only got 2 because I've just used one up. I'll find a third. Now we have 3. So, opening the back of the camera, I'll apply some synthetic grease to this metal boss at the base and on the top of that spring. Slide the take-up spool into position. The round hole goes down, of course. The slot at the top has to couple to our film advance. Apply some synthetic grease to the bush. Fit that in place. That should engage with the top of the take-up spool. It just has. And fit the 3 screws. As usual, get all 3 screws started before you do anything up tight. Otherwise you'll find that the alignment was not quite perfect and you can't get the last one in. Right, that's good. Make sure that that turns smoothly and there's no ratchet or anything on there, so it should roll evenly in both directions. That's running nice and smoothly. That's great. Next piece.